Last night, President Trump once again made some false claims about pharmaceuticals. The rate of price increases may have slightly reduced, but drug prices have certainly not been reduced. While he could have acted in the first week of his administration to lower drug prices, in his fourth year now, he has failed to do anything to actually lower drug prices for anyone. As the world's largest prescription drug purchaser, the United States spent $344 billion on pharmaceuticals in year 2018, yet we rank last among the 11 industrial countries for quality of health. Today's hearing is an opportunity to explore how the U.S. pharmaceutical industry does so well while so many Americans cannot afford soaring drug costs. Are Americans getting the new cures that they're promised, or merely tweaks around the edges to prolong patent monopolies? Big Pharma certainly is a master of innovation. Their energy just appears to be focused more on finding ways to exercise monopoly power. From tax-dodging schemes to marketing ploys, Big Pharma finds ways to manipulate at just about every turn. Today, we're unmasking some of these shadowy tactics, and we'll hear from experts about some reforms that could achieve more cures for more patients, something I know all of us want. Big Pharma has been a master innovator when it comes to making U.S. taxable income disappear overseas. We'll hear from Mr. Setzer to review what's happened with companies that shift much of their income overseas and are pleased to pay Irish taxes but not charge Americans Irish prices. After booking over $500 billion in profits offshore, the tax law that was approved here a year and a half ago rewarded the 10 largest pharmaceutical firms with $76 billion in tax breaks. Instead of investing most of what was really found money to develop more cures, most of this was used to increase stock buybacks and dividends by nearly 75%. And of course, the chief executives of those pharmaceutical companies did rather well as well, $20 million being the annual compensation for the Pfizer CEO and others a little above and a little below that. Last Friday, the health secretary, Mr. Azar, who will be coming before our full committee in the next couple of weeks, declared that the coronavirus was a national public health emergency. This is a deadly outbreak that concerns all of us, and obviously folks were scrambling to find a vaccine while governments were imposing quarantines and travel bans. Once again, patients are suffering under the reality that innovative antibiotic research is in short supply. As we see with pharmaceutical research and development for other types of treatments, the research isn't going toward identifying new pathogens. It's tweaks and follow-up therapies. Much of the productive research for new cures for these dreaded diseases, coronavirus and antibiotic-resistant strains, is in fact paid for by taxpayers, as Dr. Kessel will explain in his testimony. All of us have heard those ads: if you can't pay for your drugs, if you can't afford your drugs, Big Pharma Company X may be able to help you. I wanted to explore, and Dr. Bai will be doing this, exactly how that works, and was amazed to learn from her work that 97% of these programs exclude the uninsured. That is to say, the people who have the most need get the least help, and they're being denied charitable relief because there isn't an insurance company to pick up the tab for the drug. Ms. Keeping will be able to tell us about the toll that those false flag patient assistance programs have had on her family. These assistance programs are really a way to steer patients to high-cost drugs and ensure insurers pay the price, which we all end up paying for in higher deductibles and higher premiums. They appear to be highly profitable marketing scams that are cloaked in the veil of charity. Charity by Big Pharma appears to be mainly charity for itself. Some companies have enjoyed profit margins on their charitable donations as high as 60%, according to one study. Pharmaceutical innovation is definitely not lacking, but unfortunately it's focused on how to avoid taxes and extend monopoly power on prices indefinitely. Today, we explore how we encourage innovation that is redirected toward patients and new cures. And with that, I will call on the ranking member, Mr. Nunes, for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Chairman Doggett, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing thoughts on this very important topic. Lowering drug prices is a bipartisan priority, but I find it slightly ironic that the title of the hearing is More Cures, when every independent analyst of the Democrats' bill H.R. 3 has found it would reduce the number of cures available for families, including an 88% reduction in the number of drugs brought to market by small and emerging companies from my home state of California. Every Republican here believes the status quo is unacceptable. Both parties can work together to lower drug prices for families without reducing cures. But H.R. 3 is not the answer. Instead, we should bring up H.R. 19, a bipartisan, bicameral bill, which, unlike the Democrats' drug takeover, can actually pass the Senate and be signed into law. Everyone here has promised to lower drug prices. H.R. 19 will deliver on that promise while incentivizing new cures instead of jeopardizing them. One area of H.R. 19 we will focus on today is policies to modernize Part D of Medicare, a shared priority for Republicans and Democrats alike that will transform this popular and under-budget program for millions of seniors. In a State of the Union address last night, President Trump said, and I quote, "I am calling for bipartisan legislation that achieves the goal of dramatically lowering prescription drug prices. Get a bill to my desk, and I will sign it into law without delay." An effective bipartisan bill to lower drug prices is possible because both parties agree on so much. We both believe in making overpriced drugs affordable for American families. We also believe in stopping drug companies from gaming the system. We both believe in transparency. We also believe in empowering patients by providing them reliable information. And we both believe in eliminating distortions that reward bad behavior. Let's work together to ensure Americans have more choices, not less, and that medical innovations are encouraged, not suppressed. We are close. Let's cooperate, and let's get this done. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much for your statement, and without objection, all members who have opening statements will be made a part of our record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel today to discuss these issues. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Aaron Kesselheim, a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mr. Brad Setzer, who comes here as a senior fellow on with the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior fellow on international economics. G. Bai, we're pleased to have you here. She is both an associate professor, or she is an associate professor of accounting at Johns Hopkins School of Business, and an expert in pharmaceutical area accounting. We'll then hear from Juliana Keeping, who's a patient advocate and the mother of a child with cystic fibrosis who's had experience with these patient assistance programs. And finally, the committee is pleased to hear from Tara O'Neill Hayes, who's Director of Human Welfare Policy at the American Action Forum. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I'd ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. You've got the lights that will alert you, and we do have a deadline to be out of the room by 4, so we're going to try to stick to that. Dr. Kesselheim, would you begin with your testimony?
Thank you, Chairman Doggett, Ranking Member Nunes, and the members of the committee. Thank you for calling this session to address how the government can provide reasonable incentives for drug innovation while making sure Americans can afford the medicines they're prescribed. The process of pharmaceutical innovation is long and expensive. This innovation is crucial for patient care and the public health because drugs are among the most effective and cost-effective interventions that physicians like myself can offer. Many drugs save or extend patients' lives or improve patients' quality of life. The government offers 2 main incentives for drug innovation. So-called push incentives include government funding of R&D and tax incentives for private investment in R&D. It also offers pull incentives through 20-year patents and other long-lasting market exclusivities after drug approval that give companies time to earn back upfront investments and make profits. But during this market exclusivity, we let manufacturers charge whatever they want, so U.S. prices far exceed those for the same drug sold in other high-income countries around the world. Today, I was asked to focus on the push incentives. The first, government investment, is an extremely effective way of generating transformative new treatments. In 2019, the NIH's budget was about $39 billion, which I believe is the largest investment by any government in scientific research. One study linked all new drugs approved between 2010 and 2016 or their molecular targets back to publicly funded research. NIH also directly contributes to late-stage development. In a study of drugs approved in the last decade, we found that 25% had patents or other late-stage intellectual contributions from publicly supported research. These drugs were much more likely to get expedited FDA approval or be first in class, which are two indicators of therapeutic importance. Gleevec for CML, Sovaldi for hepatitis C infection, CAR-T treatments, gene therapy for a rare form of blindness. Each of these emerged from substantial investment by NIH and years of publicly funded work at academic medical centers and their spin-off small companies before being transferred to larger manufacturers for the final costly steps of development. The government also provides another push incentive directed mostly at the large companies with tax concessions and refunds for R&D spending. For example, a non-refundable credit allows up to 20% of a manufacturer's qualified research expenses above a base amount to be credited. An additional credit from the 1983 Orphan Drug Act could be earned by companies for clinical testing on drugs for rare diseases. It was recently reduced from 50% to 25% of qualified research expenses. But many new drugs that get FDA approval, despite being sold at high prices, do not offer important advances in efficacy or safety for patients. We reviewed the new drugs approved in 2017 and found that among those judged by expert organizations in Germany, France, and Canada, about 2/3 offered no or minor additional benefits over existing treatments. In another study, we found that 40% of the highest spending brand name drugs in Medicare were discovered many decades ago or were reformulations of previously approved active ingredients. Insulin is a great example. It was isolated a century ago and improved, but while the molecule hasn't changed much in decades, it remains a major cost driver. We should be concerned about misapplication of tax credits. Lack of clarity over what companies are allowed to define as the base amount of qualifying research can allow the credit to be applied to research that would have been done anyway. The credit can also apply to activities unnecessary for taxpayers to fund and unlikely to directly contribute to important innovation. In one ad, an accounting firm listed qualifying activities to include developing technology for compliance with various regulatory agencies and developing improvements to existing products. Such a broad definition reduces the public health impact of the credit. So what can be done? First, we need to commit more to government R&D funding. While NIH budgets grew substantially in the 1990s, they remained stagnant for many years after in inflation-adjusted numbers. The 21st Century Cures Act of 2016 promised to add some funding, but it depends on annual appropriations from Congress. And at present, when government-funded innovations are transferred to a company for commercialization, we rarely provide reasonable royalties to the government for reinvestment in R&D or to be used to lower drug prices for patients. We also do not try to determine a reasonable price for these taxpayer-funded discoveries. The committee should study how to arrange royalty arrangements or how a reasonable pricing clause associated with government-funded insights could be structured to ensure pricing patients can afford commensurate with clinical value. Disappointing levels of innovation should also lead us to re-examine tax credits as well as other incentives. Options include more narrowly defining the scope of qualifying research activities, raising the bar for documentation required to support the tax credit. The committee could also consider making the Orphan Drug Act tax credit repayable for extremely profitable rare disease drugs, which have become more common. We all want to encourage continuing drug innovation, but a new drug that patients cannot pay for does no good. We need to move beyond the idea that changes to policy that are opposed by the pharmaceutical industry will cripple the discovery of future new products. That threat is simply not valid. Congress should develop more thoughtful ways of using its many policy tools to encourage the discovery of important new drugs in both the public and private sectors, but also make sure to do so in a way that will make these medicines more affordable to the patients who need them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Mr. Setzer? Get your microphone on.
Thank you. Thank Chairman Doggett, Ranking Member Nunes, and the members of the committee for the invitation to appear here today. My testimony will focus on 3 points. 1, America has a large and growing trade deficit in pharmaceutical products. 2, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act created new incentives for the offshoring of pharmaceutical production and high-tech manufacturing jobs. 3, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act provided a windfall to the shareholders of pharmaceutical firms who had shifted profits abroad, but it hasn't generated lower prices for American consumers or a significant increase in research and development. The work of the Ways and Means Committee staff has illustrated that Americans pay by far the world's highest prices for drugs. Yet today, Americans are getting far too little back from our biggest pharmaceutical companies. The trade deficit in pharmaceuticals is now quite significant. Our 65 to 70 billion in exports fall well short of our 150 billion in imports. Those imports have increased by around 40 billion, or about 20%, since the passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. This is not a trade deficit that can be explained by competition from low-wage countries. Switzerland accounts for more U.S. imports than India and China combined. Ireland accounts for a quarter of U.S. imports. The importance of low-tax jurisdictions in this sector provides an important clue. Many pharmaceutical companies conduct the bulk of their research and development in the United States, then seek to minimize their tax burden by transferring intellectual property to places like Bermuda and then producing the drugs in yet another low-tax jurisdiction. To summarize, the inflated bill Americans pay to fill out their prescriptions is matched by an inflated import bill. There is no doubt that the international provisions of the tax code did need to be reformed. The old system encouraged indefinite deferral, building up financial assets abroad, and then borrowing against your offshore assets if you wanted to pay dividends or do a buyback. But the Tax Cut and Jobs Act unfortunately failed to end incentives for profit shifting. 3 provisions are important here: the Global Intangibles Low Tax Income, or GILTI, Foreign Derived Intangibles Income, or FDII, and the exclusion of tangible imports from an offshore subsidiary from the Base Erosion and Anti-Abuse Tax, or BEAT. First, GILTI, which was designed to limit incentives to shift or make that allowed companies to avoid tax entirely in low-tax jurisdictions. GILTI, though, suffers from 3 significant flaws. For one, it was simply set at too low a rate. For 2, it wasn't calculated on a country-by-country basis. So a firm that pays high taxes in Germany can use that to offset profits in zero-tax jurisdictions. Finally, the GILTI provides a tax exemption for the first 10% return on assets invested abroad. So the more physical assets that a firm has abroad, the lower their tax burden. Second, foreign-derived intangibles income. This was intended to encourage U.S. companies to locate their intellectual property in the U.S., but it has the inadvertent effect of encouraging American companies to export intellectual property rather than actually produce goods in the United States. Finally, excluding tangible goods imports from the Base Erosion and Anti-Abuse Tax allows Big Pharma to manufacture in Ireland and then sell without paying the anti-abuse tax to their U.S. subsidiaries. Like many Americans, I love the Irish, but the U.S. tax code should not have been designed to put Ireland first. Fortunately, there are relatively straightforward reforms to the tax code that would reduce the incentives now present to offshore pharmaceutical products, production, and jobs. Chairman Doggett has proposed eliminating the tax preference for investing abroad in the No Tax Breaks for Offshoring Act. I very much agree. The basic principle here is simple. The tax system shouldn't reward pharmaceutical companies or other leading U.S. companies for shifting jobs and production offshore. Given that pharmaceutical companies often charge 3 to 4 times as much for a drug in the United States as they charge for the same drug in other advanced economies, I don't think it is unreasonable to ask our pharmaceutical companies to pay their fair share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bai.
Chairman Doggett, Ranking Member Nunes, and the members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in today's hearing. It's a great honor to be here. I'm an associate professor of accounting at the Johns Hopkins Carrier Business School. I'm a certified public accountant. I study the intersection of accounting and healthcare policy. The opinions I express here are my own and do not represent the opinions of the Johns Hopkins University. My testimony today covers 3 issues. Number 1, drug manufacturers donating cash to patient assistance programs. Number 2, drug manufacturers donating cash to patient advocacy organizations. Number 3, drug manufacturers giving free drug samples to clinicians. The 3 issues share one thing in common. That is, drug manufacturers transfer resources to an independent entity. The independent entity uses the resource to give patients coverage of drugs that are made by the manufacturers or advocate for policies that will benefit the manufacturers. These actions lead to market distortions, price increases, and inefficient drug spending, but benefit the bottom lines of the drug manufacturers. Let's look at the first issue. Independent patient assistance programs are operated by nonprofit organizations with a tax-exempt status for the purpose to cover out-of-pocket expenditure of mostly Medicare patients. Our study found that most of these programs only cover insured patients, do not cover or do not favor the low-income patients, and they often cover expensive drugs or off-patent drugs with available cheaper alternatives on the market. So the covered patients use these drugs, and the Medicare program and taxpayers end up paying a higher expenditure. Bottom line, some independent patient assistance programs strategically cover some drugs, and the result is drug manufacturers are benefited. So here we have a very important kickback concern. The second issue is patient advocacy organizations. These are also nonprofit, tax-exempt organizations with an explicit mission to support and help patients and fight the disease. Many of them are very powerful and influential players in shaping drug policy. Many of these organizations depend on drug manufacturers for cash donations for financial viability. Some of them have been advocating for policies that are apparently misaligned with patient interest, but to benefit the bottom line of the drug manufacturers. So for patient advocacy organizations, the key issue is the conflicts of interest. The last issue is the free drug samples given by manufacturers to clinicians. Clinicians take the drug, give that to patients, and later prescribe the same drug. These are often very expensive drugs and with the cheaper alternatives on the market. And then the patients and the insurance companies are steered to those drugs and end up paying more. The issue for free drug samples given to clinicians is really the conflict of interest of physicians who receive and then distribute the free drug samples. We need the Congress to design disclosure and tax policies to influence behavior. For the kickback concern, we should eliminate or reduce tax deduction for the cash contribution of drug manufacturers and regulate the recipient entities. For the conflict of interest concern, we should improve transparency. The goal is to make sure that the patient assistance programs, patient advocacy organizations, and the physicians all act in the best interest of patients instead of benefiting drug manufacturers who give them free drugs and cash. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Keeping.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Doggett, Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the committee. I want to start by telling you about my 7-year-old son, Eli. He loves Hot Wheels, solar systems, and playing with his sister, Layla. 14 hours after he was born, he required a life-saving surgery to correct a digestive issue. 2 weeks later, we learned he had cystic fibrosis, or CF for short. CF is a rare lung disease. It impacts about 30,000 people in the United States, and today there is no cure. We face the high cost of prescription drugs almost immediately after Eli's birth. Babies are vulnerable to a life-threatening type of virus called RSV. We were relieved to find a drug called Synagis to protect Eli from RSV during cold season. To help cover our copays, we enrolled in the Drug Makers Patient Assistance Program, and Eli got the medication that he needed. The next winter, we didn't qualify for the program, and the drug that would protect my son was held just out of reach. As a result, Eli was hospitalized with RSV. So I had to watch as a team of nurses held down my terrified child to draw blood and urine samples. I heard his screams down the hall while his little arm was strung with an IV line. It was a special brand of torture that I wish upon no one. Today, Eli requires a $307,000 per year medication called Symdeko. In order to afford it, my family receives $4,000 worth of patient assistance that applies toward our deductible. And trust me, we are grateful. But from our past experiences, we know we can't rely on patient assistance funded by drug companies to always help Eli. For one, patients or families must apply every year through often lengthy and cumbersome application processes. I've spent days running down doctor's notes, paperwork, and insurance approval just to be considered for a patient assistance program. Next, once patients successfully apply, the selection process is convoluted, opaque, and ever-changing. What drug companies look for in these applications is not how much a family needs assistance. Instead, they are trying to figure out how much your insurance will pay for the drug. In fact, most uninsured Americans are systematically rejected. 97% of these so-called charity programs refuse to help people without insurance. You see, a drug company will gladly cover my $4,000 deductible if my insurance company will pay $300,000 for my son's drug. It's a great investment if you're a drug manufacturer. Research shows that for every $1 million drug companies donate to assistance charities, they make up to $21 million in sales. These programs actually reward companies for increasing drug prices. They insulate patients from the financial impact of price increases, allowing drug manufacturers to raise prices so they can extract more money from insurance companies and Medicare. As a result of the rigged system, drug prices keep rising, and the costs are being passed along to all of us. Luckily, it doesn't have to be this way. To fix the problem, Congress must address the heart of the issue. Drug prices are astronomically high and relentlessly rising. The solution is not more patient assistance to cover higher and higher drug prices. The solution is to lower drug prices. I was encouraged when the House of Representatives passed H.R. 3. The bill would finally allow Medicare to negotiate with drug companies for affordable drug prices. And the Senate has its own legislation that would help stop price gouging. The bipartisan Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act is supported by President Trump and would work in concert with H.R. 3 to drive down prices for patients. In many ways, the question this committee must answer is this: do we accept lotteries called patient assistance programs that currently determine who can afford a drug? Or do we say enough to our medications being held hostage by pharma-run patient assistance programs? The drug lobby has spent billions to convince you that this problem is too big and too complicated to fix. It's not. We can start with H.R. 3. We can pass the Senate bill. We can look at what other countries pay and finally determine that Americans will not be forced to pay 2 to 3 times more than citizens in other nations. I don't want to end patient assistance programs just because they increase drug company profits, hold patients hostage, and cost taxpayers money. I want to make patient assistance programs unnecessary. I want drug prices to be affordable. I want doctors and nurses and my loving family to control my son's health, not a patient assistance program. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hayes.
Chairman Doggett, Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the committee, I am honored to be here today to testify on the matter of drug prices and access to medications. I am officially here today on behalf of myself as a researcher at the American Action Forum, but I'm really here on behalf of my stepfather, who passed away from cancer 8.5 years ago, because the drug he needed had not yet been developed. I'm here on behalf of my mom, who was widowed at 54 years old, because drug innovation didn't happen quickly enough for her. But I'm also here on behalf of my dad, for whom high drug prices are a reality for him every single day. He's a plumber, a really good one, but he also has rheumatoid arthritis. And sometimes he's unable to work because of the pain. However, he can't afford to not work because the cost of his monthly infusions is so high, it's thousands of dollars each month. And that's not counting the 4 other drugs that he has to take each day. What you are talking about today is personal to me too. I want drugs to be affordable, but I also know that the development of new drugs saves lives. Solving both of these problems simultaneously is difficult, but I'm here today to discuss a proposal that could do just that. That proposal is already on the table and already has broad bipartisan support. It could lead to substantial savings for both taxpayers and beneficiaries, and it can do so without harming innovation. That proposal is redesigning the Medicare Part D benefit structure. The current structure of the program's benefit design, along with pricing incentives in the broader drug market, create perverse incentives for drug manufacturers and insurers to benefit from high-cost drugs. These incentives have resulted in a rapid increase in spending in the catastrophic phase of the Part D program over the past decade, meaning prescription drugs are costing taxpayers and beneficiaries more and more. Each of the existing proposals to reform the Part D program has 4 key components, each revolving around changing who is liable for what costs in the catastrophic phase. The first is capping the out-of-pocket expenses for beneficiaries. Seniors in Part D are currently responsible for 5% of all costs beyond the catastrophic threshold, at which point they've already paid thousands out of pocket. This change would end their open-ended costs. Second is reducing substantially the government's open-ended reinsurance liability in the catastrophic phase. The government currently pays 80% of costs at this point, and all of the reforms on the table would reduce this share. Third is increasing insurer liability in the catastrophic phase. Insurers currently pay 15% in this phase, MedPAC's latest report finds that insurers in Part D are now at risk for only 46% of benefit costs, down from the expected 75% in 2007, leaving them with little incentive to control costs for their beneficiaries. Fourth and finally is extending the manufacturer liability to the catastrophic phase. Under current law, manufacturers are required to pay a portion of the program's costs, but their liability is capped, and the mandatory discount they provide actually decreases as a proportion of the drug's price as the price increases. Requiring manufacturer rebates in the catastrophic phase ensures the mandatory discount increases along with the drug's price. These changes should put downward pressure on drug prices and provide greater financial protection for beneficiaries and taxpayers alike. In my analysis of the Part D redesign included in H.R. 19, I calculate that in 2022, the federal government could save $28.3 billion in reinsurance payments in a single year. Beneficiaries could save $10.6 billion in out-of-pocket costs. Insurer liability would increase $33.7 billion in that year, and drug manufacturer liability would increase by $5.2 billion. These reforms are critical to the continued success of the Part D program and have already been included in each of the major drug pricing bills that Congress is currently considering. Restructuring the program's benefit design in a way that realigns incentives away from high-cost, high-rebate drugs may be the best way to reduce overall program costs and make those program assistance programs unnecessary. Of course, these reforms would only impact Part D directly, but the Part D program represents almost a third of drug spending in the United States, meaning that successful reforms of the program could positively impact drug prices in the rest of the market. Again, I thank you for having me here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I'll defer my questions for now and call Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing today. And to all the witnesses, thank you very much for being here and for your excellent testimony. 2 years ago, the Republicans on this committee gave billions of dollars in tax cuts to big pharmaceutical companies without paying for it. They told us it would lead to better and cheaper drugs, that it would drive investment, and it would create jobs. Well, it's been 2 years, and I'd like to start by asking whether those predictions came true, because to me, the evidence looks pretty thin. Dr. Setzer, you discussed this in your testimony, and I'd like to ask you to expand on it. 2 years ago, Big Pharma got tens of billions of dollars in tax cuts. In the 2 years since, how have pharmaceutical companies used that money?
Well, it's very clear that the bulk of the tax cuts has been given back to the pharmaceutical companies' large shareholders through a very large increase in share buybacks without any reduction in dividends. So the total announced buybacks from pharmaceutical companies subsequent to the passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act has been in the roughly around $80 billion. Research and development has grown a bit, but in line with the general increase in research and development of all successful companies. The bulk of the benefits have gone to shareholders.
Has the price of pharmaceuticals fallen meaningfully since those tax cuts?
If you look at the producer price index for pharmaceuticals and take as your starting point the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the price of pharmaceuticals has gone up. As the chairman noted,
It's gone up.
it's gone up. The pace of increase may have slowed in the past 12 months, but over the course of the past 24 months, the price index is clearly up.
Has job creation in the pharmaceutical industry shot upwards since those tax cuts?
There is no evidence of any significant acceleration in job growth. I mean, the overall economy has continued to perform well, and that has led to some increase in jobs. But remember that the increase in payouts to shareholders is something like 100%, and there's been very modest increases in jobs.
And then just so I'm clear, the reinvestment of their profits relative to other industries in research and development, that hasn't led to a tremendous growth in that area?
No, I think there's one study that suggests research and development spending has gone up by like 7%, where, as I mentioned, buybacks were up by like 100%. A study by the Federal Reserve, which I think is a relatively serious economics entity, that looked at not just the pharmaceutical industry, but a broad set of America's leading companies, found that research and development grew after the Tax Cut and Jobs Act at basically the same pace that it was growing before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, whereas buybacks and dividends shot up dramatically.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kessel, earlier this year, the House Democrats passed legislation that would empower the federal government to negotiate drug prices on behalf of all Americans, including Medicare beneficiaries. Critics say that this will stifle innovation. How would you respond to that?
I don't actually think there is good evidence that it will stifle innovation. In fact, the cost savings that negotiation will allow in bringing drug prices closer to the value that they actually provide, that doesn't necessarily have to be pulled out of research and development costs. In fact, it could be pulled out of marketing expenses or administration costs or other things that drug companies spend money on. Drug companies spend less than 20% of their revenues on research and development, and in fact, actually may increase innovation by requiring drug companies to look harder for the next great cures of tomorrow to try to sustain their revenues.
So they're not going to stop selling their products here because we require the negotiations. Right.
I mean, that's how they make. The drug companies are in this to sort of make drugs and make money from those drugs. So I mean, I think that they'll continue to do that.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Hayes, one of the main focuses of both sides of the aisle in the drug pricing debate is helping seniors lower their drug costs. Can you walk us through how Part D structure works now and how the two leading bills that have been introduced would reform Part D?
Sure, I'll try to do it quickly. So I'll highlight some of just the problems.
We have lots of time, so maybe walk through
Okay.
HR 19 maybe first, and then.
Sure. In the current structure, as I stated in my opening remarks, there are several perverse incentives that exist. And so HR 19 does several things to address those concerns. First is the concern, of course, with beneficiary out-of-pocket spending. Currently, you move through the phases of the benefit as your drug spending increases throughout the year. So you hit the deductible where the beneficiary pays everything, as you can see in the chart here. And then the initial coverage phase, HR 19 would impose a 10% manufacturer liability that currently does not exist in the initial coverage phase. Currently, there is a coverage gap as well. That is where manufacturers pay a discount. It's now set at 70%. And then finally, you reach the catastrophic phase if your spending is that high. At this point, it's around $10,000 or so in drug costs that would put you into the catastrophic limit. Nearly 4 million people, we're at like 3.6 or so as of a few years ago, million beneficiaries were reaching the catastrophic phase. Over 1 million of them do not have the low-income subsidy, and so they then continue to pay 5% of all costs in the catastrophic phase until the end of the year. And so this design would provide beneficiaries with an out-of-pocket cap in HR 19 that is set at $3,100, and so once you hit that limit, you would owe no more as a patient. And then the government's liability currently in the catastrophic phase is set at 80%. Under these proposals, HR 19 specifically, that would be reduced to 20%. And so you really significantly reduce the government's reinsurance liability, which that's the part of the benefit that has been growing the most over the last decade. It's growing rapidly. And so that has put taxpayers at a huge financial risk. Finally, it would increase insurer liability in the catastrophic phase. Currently, beyond the initial coverage limit, insurers are only responsible for 5% of costs for all brand name drugs and biosimilars in the coverage gap, and then just 15% in the catastrophic phase. And so really, once a beneficiary has more than about $4,000 in drug costs, the insurer's liability significantly falls off, which really weakens their incentive to control costs for those high-cost beneficiaries. And so increasing insurer liability in the catastrophic phase will change that. And then finally, the manufacturer liability that currently exists in the coverage gap, it is set at 70%, which is quite significant, but it's only for a fixed amount of spending because the coverage gap is in the middle of the benefit structure. Once a beneficiary moves into the catastrophic phase, they're no longer responsible for any of those costs, and that means that there is a maximum amount that a drug manufacturer will ever have to pay as a rebate. And it actually encourages higher prices because that maximum rebate becomes a smaller share of the drug's price as the price of the drug increases. And so it's more punitive on lower cost drugs, which I don't think is really the intent. And so by extending manufacturer liability into the catastrophic phase, which is only capped by the end of the year, ensures that drug costs, that mandatory discount will continue to increase as drug costs increase.
And what about, do you have an analysis of HR 3?
I have done an analysis of HR 3, just specifically the Part D redesign piece of that bill. Let me find my numbers. What I did, of course, there are limitations and assumptions in this analysis, as there are in any modeling that is done. But what I did was to look at all of the drugs, and this was using CMS data from 2017 for Medicare Part D, all of the drugs for which the average spending per beneficiary for that single drug was above the threshold that would trigger a rebate. And so just like as in this plan, that is for any drug that is above the deductible, which is around $450 or so. And HR 3, because it has manufacturer liability of 30% in the catastrophic phase, would be a much greater hit to pharma. I estimated that the manufacturer liability under HR 3 would be roughly $23 billion, which is about 3 to 4 times more what's expected under current law.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today and sharing your expertise, your stories, your perspective. In particular, Ms. Keeping, thank you for sharing your story of Eli, his sister Layla. I want to mention her. It's uplifting, but also terrifying. I can only imagine. In your written testimony, you eloquently said Eli is not his illness. And I think what we're trying to ensure here is that his illness is not his destiny. And that's why it's important to make sure that he has the medicines he needs as he goes forward. As a parent, I know you want, as a parent myself, we want for all of our children to achieve their potential with no barriers and no obstacles. But as a citizen of what's the richest country in the world, we should all want Eli to reach his potential. Not just to be a blessing for your family, but to be a blessing for all of us. And that's true for every citizen, and why it's so important that we make progress. You shared your story, and I'm sure through your work you have other stories. Are there other stories you'd like to share that we need to know of patients in your community who are facing similar circumstance?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Actually, I would like to talk about older members of my community with cystic fibrosis. So the wonderful thing about all of the innovation is that it has resulted in people with CF living longer, fuller lives. It used to, sadly, take children at 6 months of age when it was first given a name in 1938. I actually have 2 friends from Texas with cystic fibrosis. They're in their 40s and one is 50. And what's incredible to me is, and wonderful for them as well, they get to live long enough where they put in some working years, which used to never be possible. And then they actually become disabled, sadly, and now these 2 individuals are both Medicare beneficiaries. And so what's happened to them, because they're on $300,000 per year drugs, that's one drug that each require, in addition to our other medications that keep them alive, is they simply can't afford their copays. They utilize patient assistance programs, but the funding runs out between June and September. And so even though they've made it this far, they fundraised for these drugs, they've even trialed the drugs, they can't afford them anymore. And ultimately, we need to lower drug prices to help them, and we also need to lower drug prices to help Eli.
Thank you. And Now, I'd love to take a moment to talk about some of the work this committee has done to address the skyrocketing prices of prescription drugs, in particular H.R. 3, the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act. It is the most significant piece of prescription drug legislation in nearly 2 decades. It will save nearly $500 billion in prescription drug spending, reduce premiums in the employer market by more than $115 billion, and use those savings to expand Medicare benefits for directly needed services. We have to continue our work with the Senate and the White House this spring to give relief to our constituents and young people like Eli. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that we get something signed into laws as soon as possible. Turning to Dr. Bai, you discussed multiple ways we can improve oversight over patient assistance programs, but at least for Medicare beneficiaries, there are multiple ways we can improve our federally run low-income subsidy programs for Part D beneficiaries. Could you discuss some of the shortcomings of the Medicare's Extra Help program and what we need to do to improve it? And what could improving the program mean for patients relying on outside assistance?
Thank you, Congressman. One way we can do is to increase the eligibility for the Extra Help program. Right now, it's 135% of the federal poverty line. Let's say we increase to 200%. That will incentivize patients to join this program and receive coverage instead of going to the independent patient assistance programs. But we must understand the drug manufacturers are very responsive, and it's a dynamic response, so they probably will increase their eligibility criteria. In our study published in JAMA last year, we found the most common eligibility criteria is 500% federal poverty line. So let's say we increase our Extra Help program to 200%. Manufacturers, together with their sponsored assistance programs, can increase eligibility to maybe 700%, and then to channel patients who would not have been eligible to the programs, and then keep this scheme.
Great, thank you. And I'm out of time, but I do want to go back to Eli for one thing, Ms. Keeping. You shared how he told you how hard it is to be brave. Unless we've been there ourselves, we can't fully appreciate how hard it is to be brave. But I'm hopeful that the members of our committee, the members of this Congress, can find the courage to do what's necessary to bring down drug costs. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Buchanan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I was very proud of our committee in terms of USMCA. We had a very bipartisan product, got signed into law, 193 Democrats and 192 Republicans. I don't think anybody would even thought that as a possibility. I think this is a real opportunity for us. I know, from what I gather anyway, Grassley and Wyden in the Senate are within striking distance, 90% there, a couple of people have told me. So I think there's a real opportunity there. The President's mentioned he'll sign it into law if we get something that makes some sense. So I want to be hopeful here we can. And I just encourage our friends that many times someone said, you work on getting a half a loaf and then work on maybe over time getting another half of the loaf. But let's find a way we can work together. People want progress. They want lower drug costs, and we've got to start moving in that direction. I'm in a district in Florida, Sarasota, beautiful, but I have 227,000 seniors, and drug costs are a big issue for them, but all over Florida and all over the country, so it's a big, big factor. I want to go back to savings and cost. Ms. Hayes, you mentioned your father's example, but taking someone like your father, what would actually be the saving for him? He's a plumber, probably self-employed, but you know, how much, when you look at the math, how much is the savings over a period of a year or two or something like that?
So I feel necessary to say my father is not yet Medicare eligible. He's not quite that old. He'll want me to say that. But assuming he was,
I didn't know how old he was.
For any beneficiary who has more spending than what is in the deductible, which the deductible, let's say in 2022 when HR 19 would go into effect, is scheduled to be $485. So for anyone who has spending above that, under HR 19, they would benefit even if they never reach the out-of-pocket cap, because this bill lowers beneficiaries' coinsurance in the initial coverage limit It currently is at 25%. Under HR 19, it would be reduced to 15% for all brand name and biosimilar products, which certainly the RA medicine that he takes is a brand name drug.
And then the other, you threw out some very big numbers in terms of savings. I think with individuals, tens of billions, and others, there's one number at 28 billion. Can you go back through that, explain how you
Sure.
get to those numbers?
Sure. So what I did, this analysis is based on CMS, the drug spending dashboard that's available for the Part D program, and I looked at, like I said, 2018 is the most recent data available, and so there is average spending per beneficiary for each drug in the program, and I used the 2018 data, increased that by 16% because that's the expected increase in enrollment between 2018 and 2022. I increased the average price by 6%. I feel like that's a fair estimate of how costs might differ from 2018 to 2022. And so then I assumed that every drug above with an average spending per beneficiary greater than the deductible would be required to pay a rebate. Now, of course, that's not the case. Generics under this plan and under current law do not pay rebates, so you have to account for that, but I didn't have a way of separating those out. And so then seeing how much of that spending would occur in each phase of the benefit, and so tally all that up for each of the various stakeholders. And so to run back through the numbers, under HR 19, beneficiaries could save $10.6 billion. And again, this is in 2022 alone. This is not a 10-year CBO style score. So in a single year, $10.6 billion in out-of-pocket savings for beneficiaries, $28.3 billion in reinsurance savings for the federal government, and then an increase in liability to the insurers of $33.7 billion, and an increase in manufacturer liability relative to current law of $5.2 billion.
I know the goal has to be we got to start bending the curve on healthcare costs and drug costs in general, because it's bankrupting the middle class, in my opinion. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Kine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding such an important hearing. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony here today, and Ms. Keeping, especially your personal story about your son, Eli. There's nothing, I think, that moves policymakers more than actual people and the impact it's having on real lives back home. So we thank you for coming and sharing that. But this is a story that many of us hear almost every day when we're back home representing our respective districts. I mean, the rising cost of prescription drugs and what it means to individual health care and their access to quality health care so they can stay productive in our society. Now, call me a little bit cynical, but all the years when our Republican friends were sitting in the majority, there was no HR 19. There was no consideration, no piece of legislation meant to drive down the cost of prescription medication for all Americans. Not until after we moved forward on HR 3 last year, which introduced price negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry to help bring those prices down. Now, Dr. Kesselheim, let me ask you about the importance of having that negotiating power and leverage with the drug companies that HR 3 provides with price negotiation. It was something that President Trump campaigned on in 2016, saying he wanted that authority. And he was going to negotiate like crazy with the drug companies to bring the price down. But now, for inexplicable reasons, he's backed off on supporting HR 3. And yet we know that in a free market, there's no more powerful dynamic between a willing seller and a willing buyer than the ability to discuss prices. In fact, the drug industry is the only industry the federal government does business with today where we are by law prohibited from discussing prices with. And that was because of the way the legislation was structured back in 2004 when the Part D plan was first formed. Dr. Kessel, how important do you think it is, even though HR 19 doesn't contain it, the Wyden bill in the Senate doesn't contain it, that we move forward with that negotiating leverage of price negotiation with the drug companies in an attempt to bring down the cost for our constituents, our consumers back home?
I mean, I think it's crucially important. Negotiating in this way is the most effective tool that we might be able to have to try to bring drug costs more in line with the value that the drugs provide. It's instructive, I think, as you mentioned, that Medicare negotiates or sets the prices for every other form of health care that it pays for, radiology, x-rays, colonoscopies, hospital prices, except for prescription drugs. And it's also instructive that every other high-income country around the world negotiates prices with the manufacturers, and that's why we pay so much more than those other countries do for the very same drugs.
Let me ask you this. I mean, we've heard the arguments. Again, we heard it here today, that if we go down the road of price negotiation, it's going to ruin innovation, risk-taking, breakthrough drugs. It's going to hold all that back. And yet you said in your testimony, I think I got it right, I quote, that threat is not valid. Why don't you think that threat's valid?
Well, I think for a couple reasons. I would say, first of all, because a lot of the research that we've done shows that really important transformative innovation originates in government and publicly funded science that occurs in academic research settings and other nonprofit institutions. And so as long as we keep that line of funding available, then we will continue to make insights and have important new innovation that is really meaningful. And I think that so I think that that's one. I think that's one reason. And I think another reason, and again, those products then do get transferred into the private sector for further development, and that can cost a lot of money, and we should account for that. But as I said earlier, I think that assuming that if we lower drug prices, that all of that money will necessarily come right out of the innovation for the most important products is a false assumption. I think that there are a lot of brand name drugs out there that drug companies are selling for very high prices that don't offer a lot of real important clinical benefit to patients, and doing better negotiating prices so that they are more in line with the value that they provide will perhaps provide actually more incentive for the innovation that we need.
My time's expiring, but last night we had the State of the Union address, and sometimes it's the dog that doesn't bark that should receive more attention. And last night, while the President called for a bill that would lower the cost of prescription drugs, that he'll sign on it, he didn't offer any specifics or any leadership on this issue. In fact, the only two healthcare proposals he talked about was their promotion of the so-called junk insurance plans that they're offering, so people can literally pay to be underinsured, and also price transparency with hospitals. Would either one of those proposals have any impact on prescription drug prices that our consumers are facing?
No, they wouldn't.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your insight here today. It's interesting that we're having this hearing today. I hope that it's in good faith and perhaps maybe even in realization that H.R. 3 has major issues, primarily wouldn't pass the Senate, and major obstacle there. But I hope that we can get back on track the bipartisan work that was done that I think has led to H.R. 19. Clearly, there were bipartisan efforts moving along before H.R. 3 derailed those. I think it's very difficult to dispute that. And so as we sort through these issues, the word negotiation is tossed around quite a bit. To say that there is no negotiation included in Medicare Part D is just flat out false. What is true about Medicare Part D is that negotiation takes place, and it takes place as delegated to the private sector. I think a far better place for it to be located than in the public sector. If the government were going to be the only payer in this, or it certainly would lead to a single formulary, I don't know of any seniors who are begging for a single formulary. And I think this is a very obvious concept that probably doesn't get enough discussion amidst all of these back and forth, I guess, that is taking place regarding drug pricing. But I hope, again, that we can get back to the bipartisan discussions that we know have been taking place, and that I think ultimately could pass the Senate and be signed by the President. I think the President is anxious for this issue to be resolved, as indicated last night. And I think, can't speak for him, but I don't think he is being overly prescriptive, for lack of a better term, in terms of what he wants the bill to look like, but he wants to deliver results, and positive results that actually speak to and address actual cures, rather than inviting a whole bunch more government intrusion that I would argue has kind of gotten us to the problems that we face today. And it's interesting hearing the dialogue on TCJA. I'm just wondering, Mr. Setzer, are you advocating for undoing the TCJA?
I believe there are a range of approaches that could be adopted that would result in substantial improvements over the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. One approach is that put forward by the chairman, which would go back to a system of more global taxation. I think that would be a very effective deterrent to offshoring profits and jobs. But if you wanted to work within the structure of the TCJA, you could raise the guilty tax level. I think many experts believe that if that were set at 75 rather than 50% of the headline rate, that would reduce incentives. You could shift to a country-by-country calculation. That would get rid of one of the really perverse incentives now, which makes it encourages a company that has guilty liabilities to produce in Germany, because you can offset that against your guilty, when you can't offset U.S. profits and U.S. production against your guilty. So there's a lot of steps that could be taken within and outside.
There's a lot that some might advocate for that perhaps it just wouldn't get enough votes. But President Obama even advocated for a more competitive corporate tax policy because of the inversions that were taking place. And I think that is often left out of the discussion here, that on that premise that we needed to be more competitive across our economy, whether it's pharmaceuticals or other parts of our economy, we needed to take some action. And I think we have seen positive results, and perhaps we can obsess over, I think, smaller issues and yet miss the bigger picture. But to roundly dismiss the fact that the private sector would still deliver innovative products amidst a 95% tax rate in what could be the case, I think it's dangerous to be very dismissive of expert data and information along the way. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still thinking about your opening comment about our friends in the pharmaceutical industry who are happy to pay Irish tax rates but won't pay Irish prices. There's a certain cynicism that I think is not warranted. Our friends on the other side of the aisle suggest if there is any effort to restrain, however minorly, in terms of negotiations, that somehow we're going to stifle innovation. That the very first thing that the drug industry is going to do is punish consumers. They won't cut back on advertising or executive compensation or drug buybacks. They're going to cut back on innovation. I think that's an extraordinarily cynical view, which I, for one, refuse to accept. They're going to get away with what they can get away with, I think, if we permit this. The notion that somehow we're going down a path that is going to be negative if we end our isolation as the only country that is not involved with some sort of competitive effort. I mean, every other country does it. Every company that has medical benefits is involved with some form of competition and bidding. And the notion that somehow we should be the island, that the United States should pay the highest prescription drug prices in the world by far, and we carry innovation for the rest of the world, or else they're going to hold American consumers hostage. I don't believe that. I think, Dr. Kessel, you made the comment that in foreign countries that have negotiated lower prices, that the drug companies still make a profit on those medicines. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, they do. There's still, and when drug manufacturer CEOs have come before other committees, they've said that, and they sell their products in those countries at those prices because they make profits on those prices, on drugs and those prices in those countries.
I think that's one of the underlying points that really needs to be made. But when we talked about, I mentioned that I don't think they're that cynical, but then I hear the testimony from Ms. Keeping, Dr. Bai, talking about how these mechanisms, the assistance programs are structured. That sounds a little cynical. Setting the pricing at a very high level, not the poorest people, and not extending this drug assistance to people who don't have generous insurance programs. Did I hear that right? Either of you care to comment on that?
Yes, these programs are called in appearance assistance programs, but if we think about the kickback concern, it's really a mechanism designed to bring money to drug companies. There are studies showing that if you spend $10 to support these assistance programs, you'll get between $6 and $30 return. So if we think from the investment perspective, that is very lucrative strategy.
But it is not designed to benefit the most people at the lowest cost. It's designed to maximize profits for the drug companies. In fact, if they're giving the product, they're able to be eligible for tax benefits for the product that they're...
Thank you, Congressman, for bringing that aspect. Yes, beyond all the payments, extra payments from the third-party insurance plans, drug manufacturers get 100% tax deduction for their cash contribution to patient assistance programs, as long as it's below the 10% taxable income for charitable contribution limit.
Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate having this hearing, but these are areas that I hope we can explore a little bit in ways of helping the drug companies redesign these programs so they benefit beleaguered individuals, not their bottom line. And I think that's entirely appropriate. I don't think it should be that hard. And I think that's something that people on both sides of the dais ought to be able to be comfortable with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this today. And thank you all for being here, taking time out of your private lives to come and share some of your ideas. Ms. Keeping, what you're going through with Eli reminds me of somebody back in my home district. We've had these conversations before, and I think that sometimes we get so caught up in the politics that we misunderstand what the policy should be. I just want to read something to you. This is another mother who's going through something similar to you. It starts off, Dear Congressman Kelly, my name is Sarah Stewart, and I'm from St. Petersburg, Pennsylvania. It's my understanding that the House Ways and Means Committee is having a public hearing on H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act of 2019. It appears this legislation does not have bipartisan support. It needs to take a more balanced approach. The balance is needed for patients like my 10-year-old daughter, Maddie. Maddie suffers from a rare mitochondrial deletion condition called Pearson syndrome, which is a disorder that occurs as a result of mutated genes in the body. These genes impact the mitochondria of her cells and prevent them from producing enough energy for her body to function properly. Pearson syndrome is difficult to diagnose because it affects each individual differently. Maddie's symptoms through the years have included being blood transfusion dependent for several years, the inability to heal after sun exposure damage, becoming a type 1 diabetic, progressively losing her hearing and her vision, kidney failure, and several other daily complications, including developmental delays when having a body that runs on limited energy. It has truly been heartbreaking to see her endure this disease, but she continues to defy the odds. My simple message to you, Mr. Kelly, and the rest of the committee, is there is no cure or treatments for Pearson syndrome. Each day is a struggle to keep Maddie balanced so her body is able to better cope with symptoms of this terrible disorder. All we have, as well as many other families across the world, is hope. Please don't let partisan bickering impact the ability of researchers to discover and innovate new therapies that could save Maddie's life one day. The clock is ticking, and Maddie is fading. Thank you. And the reason I read that is because I think sometimes when we get involved in these political debates, we forget about who it is that we're debating for. And I think both sides have exactly the same intention, and that is to make the innovation of these wonderful new drugs that are out there possible, but at a price that the end user can afford. And so we go back and forth and back and forth, and the thing that I would just say, one of the things is that we have to have bipartisan agreement. One of the problems with H.R. 3 is that it was never going to get past a messaging point in the House, because it still had to go to the Senate. H.R. 19 does include, in almost every aspect of that law, it was bipartisan. There's 36 different provisions from bills passed out of either the Ways and Means and Energy Commerce Committees with unanimous bipartisan support. All but one of these provisions is sponsored by a Democrat. 17 different provisions from bills passed out of the House of Representatives with bipartisan support. 28 different provisions from bills passed out of the 3 different Senate committees with bipartisan support. 21 of these packages or provisions come from the Grassley-Wyden drug pricing package, S2543, the Prescription Drug Pricing and Reduction Act. So I would submit that the real illness isn't in the population. The real disease that we're fighting is, at the end of the day, somebody has to lose. And we look at it from a political perspective, and it's not the Republicans that have to win and the Democrats that have to lose, or the Democrats that have to win and the Republicans have to lose. At the end of the day, the American people have got to win. There is no reason why this committee and the other committees in Congress can't look at the end goal. And this is one of the things that is the most frustrating, I think, for both sides of the aisle, because we want to get there, but sometimes our hands are tied. We were making great progress on a bipartisan answer to this. H.R. 3 is not that answer. We know that H.R. 3 was a messaging bill, and I'm not casting any disparaging remarks to my colleagues. I'm just saying that at some point, the end goal has to be the person who's waiting. This little girl was one of 80 people with Pearson's disease a year and a half ago. She's now one of 40. The clock is ticking. And there's no reason why in this country, and in this Congress, and under this administration, which, by the way, this pharmaceutical pricing thing did not begin with the election of Donald Trump. This has been around for a long time. So I want to thank all of you for your input and your continued input, because you have great ideas. And all I'm encouraging is all our members is, let's get past the politics and get to the policy. The policy is the answer. There's great policy, there's great talent, and there's great help from the private sector. So thank you all for being here today. I would love to ask you questions, but we all know the answer. It's all answer. If there were no R's or no D's and there were just we's, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Kelly, consistent with committee practice, we'll now go to a 2-to-1 questioning ratio, and I call Ms. Chu.
Dr. Bai, I'd like to ask you about some of the tactics that pharmaceutical companies use to market their products, specifically the use of samples, which you brought up in your testimony. Over a decade ago, the drug manufacturer Purdue used free patient coupons to provide 7 to 30-day supplies of OxyContin. At the end of this marketing program, more than 34,000 of these samples had been redeemed, and it's estimated that up to 50% of the patients who used OxyContin were at risk of becoming addicted. These drug makers offer free samples because they work. They encourage the use of their product. And in fact, from 1997 to 2016, the pharmaceutical companies spent more on free samples than they did on direct-to-consumer advertising, and more on advertising than they did on research. So that's why I introduced H.R. 2064, the Sunshine for Samples Act, which would require drug manufacturers to report the value of the samples they give away to providers and require that the information be made public on the open payments database. So, Dr. Bai, how would transparency measures like this help us better understand the pharmaceutical drug market and help bring down the cost of prescription drugs?
Thank you very much, Representative Chu. First, I would like to appreciate your effort and also from Ranking Member Nunes. So to propose and putting forward this very impactful and, in my opinion, it's going to be effective proposal to reduce the conflict of interest existing in the physician space. As you mentioned, in 2016, pharmaceutical companies spent $13.5 billion on free drug sample, excluding detailing, just the drug sample. That is almost 70% of the professional marketing spending. So this huge amount of money spent not for no reason, not for goodness of heart, right? So it's all about getting patients steered to use the drug, which has many consequences, including the one you give us. As I mentioned earlier, most of these drugs are very expensive and have alternatives on the market that is much cheaper. If we make an amendment to extend the Sunshine Act to cover free samples, I think this will be a very important step to improve the transparency, to reduce the conflict of interest, because we'll deter any wrongdoing or any actions from physicians that is not aligned with the patient's best interest. And also, the administrative cost is going to be limited because we're already having this database maintained by CMS. So we're just adding one aspect. So it's going to be effective and efficient.
Thank you for that. And on another topic, Dr. Kesselheim, I think that there is an issue that hasn't gotten sufficient attention in the debate on drug pricing, and that's the impact of new, extremely high-cost therapies on our health system, such as hepatitis C, Sovaldi, the drug to cure that was offered on the market for $84,000 for a 12-week course of treatment before competitors came to the market. So as a result, Medicaid programs in 27 states limited which patients could access the drug for fear of bankrupting their state Medicaid programs. So Dr. Kesselheim, can you discuss the strain that these new high-cost, often curative drugs like Sovaldi have or are expected to have on federal payers like Medicare? And would something like a $100,000 drug to treat Alzheimer's cause similar problems? What is the solution to this?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And I think that the fundamental question is, since that price is set by the manufacturer, the fundamental question is, does that drug deserve to cost that amount? And we don't currently ask that question. The government pays, in general, the amount that the company sets. As was mentioned, the negotiation happens at a much lower level, which makes it much less effective. And in some cases, there are restrictions on the formularies that require drugs to be covered. So there's really no legitimate negotiation at all. So I think the first question is, is that drug actually worth it? And in many cases, it might not be. In some cases, it might actually be worth it. I mean, in the case of a drug like Sovaldi for hepatitis C infection, that was a really very effective drug. And in those cases, we need to figure out what the drug is, what reasonable price is for the drug, and then how to pay for it as a community so that we can cover as many people as possible and people can get a benefit from it. In your example of the Alzheimer's disease drug, I think the fundamental question is, what does that drug actually do? Does it actually cure Alzheimer's disease or extend patients' lives? And if so, how much should it cost? And if it does need to cost a lot of money, how can we pay for it? And I think the answer is we can pay for it because we do a better job negotiating and not paying for drugs that don't offer substantial value to the healthcare system.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sessinger, right? Sessinger? Did I get that? Okay. I want to thank you for your testimony. Trade is critical to our economic well-being. And as Vice Chair of the Committee on Small Business, I recognize the strength of our nation's small businesses and communities as a whole rely heavily on trade and our ability to compete on the global market. In your written testimony, you discussed the fact that despite being home to many of the world's most successful pharmaceutical companies, the U.S. was largely growing trade deficit in pharmaceuticals. Can you talk a bit more about the reasons behind the trade deficit and how does the Tax Cut and Job Act play into this? Now, understanding that the Trade Act, when it was passed, it was not bipartisan. The Trade Act that we just did was bipartisan. So I'm very much interested in your thoughts, because I agreed that both had to happen, but, you know, obviously it was something. So can you speak to it, talk a bit more about the reasons behind it?
I'd be very happy to. I think it is one of the most striking trade statistics that our trade deficit in pharmaceuticals is now about equal to our trade surplus in aircraft. Now, in both aircraft and pharmaceuticals, America is the home of very successful companies, acknowledging that Boeing has a serious problem with the 737 MAX. But it is very, very difficult to understand, without looking at the tax code, why the U.S. runs such a large trade deficit in pharmaceutical products. I think the answer isn't because of tariffs or trade policy. I think the answer lies in tax policy. Under the old tax law, the basic game, the idea behind all the complex tax strategies was to shift profits offshore, because then the tax on that profit could be indefinitely deferred. And there was always a hope that a Homeland Investment Act or some other special law would come along that would let you bring the money, the tax-deferred profit, offshore, onshore at a special low rate. Under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, there's a new set of incentives that have resulted in much the same set of distortions. The idea under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is to take advantage of the very low tax rate on global intangibles income, half the tax that you pay, that a small business pays, because a small business isn't going to have an offshore subsidiary in Bermuda. A small business isn't going to manufacture in Singapore. A small business will typically have their intellectual property with themselves, produce themselves, and not set up these complicated subsidiary-based structures. But because the tax law allows intellectual property rights to be transferred across subsidiaries, and because it incentivizes offshore production, because that's the easiest way to take advantage of the special low tax rate on intangibles, one of the inadvertent byproducts of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was that it created a new incentive to produce offshore. And I think you see that. I think that you see that in rising imports of pharmaceuticals, and I think you see that in the fact that the amount of profit that American multinationals book in the world's 7 low-tax jurisdictions hasn't gone down.
And although we attempted to modify the new Canadian-Mexican deal, we attempted to modify, what's your sense of the modification of what we did?
I mean, I think directionally, that was a good step. I think we have negotiated far too hard, we as a country, have spent too much time negotiating for the offshore profits of pharmaceutical companies. And I think the effort that was made in the USMCA to achieve more balance was welcome. However, it's hard to fix a problem in the tax law in a trade negotiation. So I don't think it went nearly far enough.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Holding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the chairman and my other colleagues here on the committee, my priority is to support my constituents, which means empowering patients and physicians to make the best medical decisions possible, ensuring access to every treatment option out there. In order to invest in building healthier communities, we must continue to support investment in innovative cures. For the implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we had a real issue with inversions and foreign acquisitions. TCJA provisions that moved the United States towards a territorial tax system were true game changers in making U.S. companies more competitive, which continues to create more jobs in our districts. Because of the real reforms made by this committee and TCJA, the U.S. is a more attractive place to invest than ever before. This means more money for research into innovative cures and high-paying American jobs, money that otherwise would be going to foreign competitors. Drug pricing policy should build on this momentum. If we embrace socialist price-setting schemes or Washington-sanctioned compulsory licensing, which my friend, the chairman, and 127 of his colleagues support, global investment and the innovation it supports will most certainly be at risk. Innovation paves the way for the development of cutting-edge therapies and technologies and is and should remain the cornerstone of America's medical system. Innovators large and small around this nation are creating new vaccines, developing therapies such as CAR T, testing cures for Alzheimer's and ALS, and transforming modern medicine. Congress would be remiss to stymie this incredible progress with misaligned policy incentives. So as a committee, this is our 6th exercise examining policy to curb drug costs for our constituents. We all agree, both sides of the aisle, that bad actors across this system must be checked and that we must cap seniors' out-of-pocket costs. Many of us here on both sides of the dais, as well as our colleagues in the Senate, agree on the need to alter the Part D benefit design and directly lower seniors' out-of-pocket drug costs. So let's send a bill to the President's desk that does just that and protects innovation. So my question is to Ms. Hayes. You've talked extensively about the redesign of Part D, which is laid out in H.R. 19. So building on that, how would that redesign continue to incentivize innovation in medicine?
Sure. So drug development is, of course, very risky and expensive, and it requires significant investment, and that often comes from venture capitalists. As Dr. Kesselheim mentioned, there is a lot of basic research that is done at the NIH, and in fact, I believe every drug developed over the last several years started with funding and research that was done at the NIH. However, that's a very small piece of it. Real drug development, the biggest part of the investment happens with drug manufacturers and investments that they get from venture capitalists. And in order for a capitalist to make that huge investment up front, where there is no guarantee of a return on investment, because it is so risky to develop a drug, and very, very few, I believe it's less than 1%, actually ever come to market, they need to know that if it pays off, you know, it was worth the investment. And so they need some return on that investment. I bring that up because there are concerns with reduced revenues and the impact that that will have on making those investments. If there's not enough money coming back for a drug that actually does make it to market, then that investment's not going to be worth it. And so where that line is very difficult to say, but there certainly is a risk, and at some point it will have a negative effect. And so in this proposal, for instance, relative to the original Senate Finance Bill, which would have had 20% manufacturer liability in the catastrophic phase and only in the catastrophic phase. There was concern that that would disproportionately impact particularly expensive drugs and really have a harm or have discourage the development of those expensive, innovative drugs. Whereas H.R. 19 more evenly spreads the liability throughout the benefit, and so you have 10% liability above the deductible all the way through. And so it is, I think it's fair to say that the liability to drug manufacturers will not be quite as targeted on more expensive drugs and will be more evenly distributed across the industry.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Horsford?
Thank you, Chairman Doggett. I want to thank you for hosting this very important hearing to continue our committee's ongoing work on drug pricing. I'm extremely proud of the work that our full committee did in passing H.R. 3, the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act. As a co-sponsor of the bill, I am proud that we took bold action to address the growing, untenable cost of life-saving prescription medications. But today we get to address the ongoing challenges in the pharmaceutical industry itself and the inherent flaws in our tax structure regarding drug manufacturers. Dr. Bay, let me get this straight. Big Pharma, who last year made a combined industry profit of hundreds of billions of dollars, provides, quote, discount assistance to consumers in need of, and in some cases, life-saving medications, and then they take a tax deduction for these discounts? Is that correct?
Correct. If these so-called discounts are cash contributions to patient assistance programs or patient advocacy organizations, yes.
And worst yet, as the subcommittee chairman indicated, those without insurance don't get the same discount. So the people most in need don't get the same help. Is that also correct?
So the people who are most in need are not being treated preferentially by these programs. So they have the most common eligibility of 500% federal poverty level. So that's obviously very high. It's not giving any advantage to the low-income patients. But also, they do not cover uninsured.
Right. So in short, Big Pharma took advantage of an estimated $1.4 billion in tax deductions, this on top of the cut in the corporate tax rate that President Trump and the Republicans handed them in 2017. That sure sounds like a racket to me. And to divert attention away from this issue, my colleagues on the other side want to talk about innovation, which has been proven not to be the case based on the investment that we take from the passage of H.R. 3 towards additional cures that are needed. But I want to bring attention to the constituents. And Mrs. Keeping, thank you very much for sharing the story of Eli. I have a constituent, Tyler, from North Las Vegas, who shared that he is prescribed 10 medications, most of which are simply too expensive to afford. At one point, after a stay in the hospital and then a nursing home for 4 weeks, he was prescribed 25 prescriptions. He says, quote, I had to decide which prescription was more important. I did without some, like my inhaler and my EpiPen. As he puts it, I'm getting up there in years. So what happens if I need chemo or have to stay in a nursing home? I'm out of luck if that ever happens. And even in the best of times, Tyler cannot make it on his own these days. He relies on Medicare to help cover some of his health care costs, and his children help him as much as they can. Unfortunately, the story like this, like Tyler and like Ms. Keeping, and families and seniors across this nation are all too familiar. That is why we work to pass H.R. 3. And in my district, I've got 87,000 constituents who are enrolled in Medicare Part D, 471,000 who are enrolled in private health insurance, all of whom stand to benefit from transformative reform on drug pricing. So my question is, with all due respect to this panel and your expertise, where are the big pharma CEOs? Come to the table and explain to me why you deserve these tax deductions on the backs of American families. Why is it that Americans have to suffer for your profits? And why are my colleagues willing to distract from the major issues and make this about innovation when they know very good well that we're all for innovation and more cures?
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not, because the
It would
president...
have been nice to invite them here. They weren't invited.
They are invited at any point to come to my office and explain to me why you deserve $1.4 billion in tax deductions on the backs of American families. The president said he wants a bill on his desk. Well, I would encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 3, the Senate Republicans to bring it up for a vote, and let's stop playing games with American people's health care. I yield back.
Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on the, there was some discussion about Alzheimer's and standard treatments for it. Aricept is a standard treatment for Alzheimer's. It is estimated to help 50% of Alzheimer's patients stave off the onset by maybe 6 months to a year. The Aricept era drugs were developed in the late 1990s. Parkinson's, there's no standard treatment, but the medication and the other alternative is surgery. The medication standard treatment was developed in the late 1970s. Pharmaceutical companies argue that if we were to try to negotiate volume discounts with them, that drug development research would be hurt. It doesn't sound as though they're doing it in all areas anyhow. Pharmaceutical industry last year spent $6.5 billion on direct consumer advertising. The United States is only one of 2 countries that allow direct consumer advertising. And my concern is when you're appealing to consumers, you're not really appealing to science, you're appealing to emotion. And if you notice, like, for example, there's a commercial for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, an awful disease. And the commercial features a sunny day, good upbeat music, everybody's happy and healthy, and everybody's good looking. And my sense is that that direct consumer advertising, what's it intended to do? It's obviously intended to potentially manipulate the behavior of somebody that's suffering to go to a doctor and beg to have him or her prescribe this disease. I also read that every $1 spent on advertising for pharmaceutical drugs increases the retail costs by $4.20. Medicare Part D last year spent $68 billion on prescription drugs. It's estimated that Medicare Part D will spend $111 billion each year over the next decade. All payers, government and consumers and insurance companies, it's about $350 billion. It's a lot of money, but it's also a lot of leverage. It's a lot of leverage to drive down the cost and demand more accountability. The other issue on this, argument that if you were to negotiate volume discounts, it would thwart the pharmaceutical industry's, research efforts. The United States government does most of the basic research in drug development, and the basic research is not profitable. It's when those drugs are developed to the point where they reach clinical trials to test efficacy and toxicity that they potentially become profitable to be marketed to consumers. So, Dr. Kesselheim, I would ask you, do you buy the argument that negotiating significant volume discounts would thwart drug industry research toward the development of new drugs?
No, I don't buy that. And in part, I don't buy that. The way that H.R. 3 is organized, it's organized so that we end up negotiating prices to try to come to a price that's commensurate with the value that the drug provides. And so for the most valuable drugs, most important drugs to patients, we might end up still spending a lot of money, but the value of negotiation is that for drugs that don't add a lot of value, which unfortunately is a majority of drugs that are being approved by the FDA these days, then we are not going to be spending high prices for them. And so that actually, not only does it make the spending more efficient, it increases the incentives for manufacturers to invest in the highest value innovation. And so I think that's a potential positive benefit of a bill like H.R. 3.
Thank you.
I'll yield back. Thank you.
Dr. Winstrup?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I do get concerned because, once again, we have a panel of people that aren't out in the trenches taking care of patients on a day-to-day basis. And it really would be nice to hear from some people that are in that arena. And, you know, I don't like when we sit here and yell at each other. This should be a think tank. We should put our heads together. You know, I will say, like Mr. Higgins, you had the question, legitimate question about ads. My experience, ads bring a lot of patients to the doctor to be checked out when they haven't been getting checked out. And we can start to prevent and take care of illnesses when that happens. And I would also want to comment on the comments about samples. The sample's not the problem, doctor. It's the prescriber. It's how the prescriber is using the sample. I practice in a large orthopedic group, and I can tell you how we use samples. We would try the least expensive method first, a generic. Absolutely. If it didn't work, or if there's a contraindication, we may be inclined to want to try a more expensive drug. Maybe that's a brand, maybe that doesn't have a generic yet. And so if it is expensive, I certainly did not want to write a prescription for a lot of pills that were going to cost a lot of money if that one doesn't work either. That's when you use a sample. The problem's not the sample, it's the prescriber. It's the overuse. And Brock talked about OxyContin. That's a whole nother issue of an abuse of a medication. And we could go into that, but that's for another day. But that's what we have to realize. Get off the sample. Get on the prescriber and how they're using the samples. That would make the most sense. Doctor, you talked about like cure for hepatitis C. We've also got to consider, yeah, that's an expensive drug, but what it is saving in the long run is huge. The palliative care, a liver transplant, that costs a whole lot more than that drug. And that drug, like so many things in a free market, has come down, especially as volume increases. But healthcare is a little different in the free market. I get that, because there's this human factor here about patient care that has to be considered. This isn't like a TV or a cell phone or a car. But sometimes it's urgent in healthcare. This is the balance we have to work out. I'll use rheumatoid arthritis as an example. And I had a patient came here as an advocate. We got to drive down the cost of these biologics. It's really costing me a lot. And this is a patient I knew for 20-some years, and I'd say, well, remember the drug you were on that worked for a while and then didn't? And then you had another one. And it worked for a while, and then it didn't. And now you're on this, and it's working. And I can tell you you've avoided surgery because of this drug. I used to have to do reconstructive surgery of the feet from rheumatoid arthritis, and I quit seeing it. These are dynamic savings. So there's always this balance. And we need to look at that and quit arguing with each other on innovation. You don't like innovation. We all love innovation. We need innovation. We got to find ways to make sure that it can still keep happening, that we are doing things ethically and finding the best answers we possibly can for our patients. And with that, I will just tell you that I think H.R. 3 is a negative towards innovation. And we worked very hard on trying to reduce the cost of drugs in a bipartisan fashion. And politically, those efforts have now been swept off the table. And I don't care what happened in the previous administration. I don't care what happened when we were in charge. I'm talking about now, right now. And that's where we need to go. I appreciate all your input today. This is multifaceted, it's challenging, and it's difficult. And I hope that we can come to our senses here and do the right thing and try and make a path towards better care for all the patients, because that is the bottom line. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Chairman Doggett, for holding this hearing, and as a member of the Ways and Means Committee who's not a member of the subcommittee, I appreciate you allowing me to participate. This is a subject that I take very seriously. And I do appreciate Dr. Wenstrup's contributions as a physician. I defer to him But I also think it's probably not helpful to diminish the experience of the people on the panel in dealing with care on the front line.
Well, the gentleman yield. I didn't.
Very
I
briefly.
thank them all for their input.
I
and
understand,
their-
but my only point is that you indicated that they may not be on the front line. And I would suggest, I suspect Dr. Kesselheim might have some clinical experience. And I know for sure Ms. Keeping knows a little bit about caring for patients on the front line. I think you all bring really important perspectives, including an understanding of what patients deal with on a regular basis. You know, I just recently had a roundtable discussion in my district on the cost of insulin. And, you know, I know there's a lot of debate around this subject, but it is a fact that insulin's been around for a while, almost 100 years. And I know there have been changes, but what I've heard here is that there is not really changes that justify the kind of price changes that we've seen in the cost of insulin, but that other factors are driving that. And we've all talked about our constituents who bring this experience. I'll talk about one of my constituents. Her name's Katie. I know her pretty well. She's my daughter. And she is an insulin-dependent type 1 diabetic who's 28 years old and wants to be independent of her mom and dad. We love her. We want to help take care of her. She went to college. She works in her profession. And she spends half of her paycheck for the price of being diabetic. Half of what she earns. And this discussion has piqued my curiosity about some of the ways that the pharmaceutical industry attempts, or at least ostensibly attempts, to deal with these challenges. This issue of patient assistance programs. You know, I had assumed that maybe they had some public relations value, which obviously they may, but from listening, it seems that there might be something much more at play here. So I have a couple of questions. One for Ms. Keeping. First of all, thanks for being here and telling your story. But I was interested in your experience, the way you described your interaction. How accessible and reliable do you view these patient assistance programs to be? How easily are they navigated by somebody who does not have a deep background in healthcare policy or an understanding of how these systems work?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'm happy to answer. From my own family's lived experience, the patient assistance programs are out there and they're available, but they're not always accessible to us when we need them, which is why my son, Eli, was hospitalized with a preventable condition called RSV. My overarching thought here is patient assistance programs should not be necessary because we should lower the prices of prescription drugs in order to help Eli and keep him safe.
I completely agree with that. The idea that they would be there for a limited number of patients, and I was particularly curious how 1 year you qualified and the next year you didn't. Was there some substantial change in your economic circumstances from 1 year to the next that precipitated that change?
No.
Thank you. Dr. Kesselheim, I wonder if you might comment a bit on how these programs affect pricing overall, or perhaps Dr. Bai might opine on this. Does it have an effect, do these programs have any effect on pricing for pharmaceutical products across the marketplace?
Well, I think as Dr. Bai mentioned, and I would agree, I am a primary care internist and I'm flying back to Boston tonight because I have office hours tomorrow morning. But I would say that the primary care internist, as a primary care internist, these patient assistance programs are helpful to certain patients who are able to access them. But I think that, as Dr. Bai pointed out, they maintain a high cost of drugs overall because they take away some of the demand that might otherwise be created to try to lower prices. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman. But these programs actually remove the barrier for drug price increase in the future because they desensitize the patients. They no longer have cost exposure. These are small portion of patients, but their loss of this cost exposure has a huge impact on drug manufacturers' motivation to increase price in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and I thank the chairman for allowing me to participate, and I yield back.
Thank you. And since I've held my questions, I have a few after having the benefit of my colleagues' questions and yours. First, let me say that with reference to the argument that has been made here today by a number of our Republican colleagues that the solution here is just to pass the bills in the Senate, I'm not opposed to what's been discussed in the Senate and what has been discussed here about the out-of-pocket expense cap and the need to reach catastrophic, to deal with this issue of catastrophic coverage that's changed with the leap from last year. I think we should do that. The problem, and one of the reasons that Big Pharma is an advocate for that, is that it doesn't require anything out of their pocket. We won't see a reduction in manufacturers' prices if we deal with this. That's the very narrow action that's being proposed, is to call on Big Pharma to do nothing about its outrageous prices. So I think we have to combine what has been proposed in the Senate and what has been proposed here with some meaningful negotiation in order to bring those prices down, and we certainly need to address the other issues that have been raised here today. As to some of those issues, let me begin with you, Dr. Kesselheim. You know, we hear so much about the tremendous cost of developing new drugs, and I know that often there is a big cost, but one of the studies that is often cited is from your neighbor in Massachusetts at Tufts, that they have a study that was in fact funded by the pharmaceutical industry concerning research and development costs. Can you give your assessment of that study?
Yeah, that is a study that is widely cited, and it comes from the industry-funded Tufts Center for Drug Development. It provides an estimate for how much cost of development is based on a cohort of drugs for which the details were not revealed, but they were supposed to be self-originated drugs, which is a smaller sample of the actual sample of drugs, which would include government funded drugs that originate in government funding. $1.2 billion of that number is based on cost of capital, and we talked a lot today about where actually pharmaceutical manufacturers have a lot of their capital. And it also doesn't take into account a lot of the tax credits that drug companies get for the work that they do. So I think that number is an overestimate. But you know, as to what the real number is, that's debatable. But I agree with you. It is an expensive prospect. Certainly, some drugs might cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But I do think that number is an overestimate overall.
And is it a fair summary of your testimony that if we were to get new cures, we don't need new tax breaks for pharmaceutical companies, we need direct public investment through the National Institutes of Health, other research institutions that are focused on developing the drugs that we need?
That's right. I think that trying to offer more tax breaks would be a ineffective and indirect way of trying to get what we need. What we really need is more investment into the particular questions that we want to ask. If it's related to important new antibiotics or important new treatments for neurologic conditions, then we should direct more federal funding towards those conditions because that has a proven track record of success of identifying new treatment modalities for those kinds for other conditions, and then of course think about, well, how much is that the treatments that emerge from that how much are those going to end up costing on the other end, so that we can ensure that they're available to the patients who need them at a fair price.
Well, you mentioned antibiotics, and there have been a number of articles in the press of late that we're running out of antibiotics because of overuse, that there are drug strains out there that there just doesn't appear to be any cure for. And there has been legislation, in fact, it's bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate that says, well, the only way we can get that new antibiotic that we need is another tax incentive. You don't agree with that approach?
Correct. I don't agree with that approach.
And with reference to the investments we make, you think it is reasonable to set some guidelines on how much people will have to pay if the taxpayer financed the research?
Right. I mean, I think that people have charged that in these cases, taxpayers are paying twice. They're paying on the front end for the key research that leads to the fundamental discoveries and taking on a lot of that risk, because a lot of that early investment is where the most risk is. If drug companies come in later in the game and make their investments later in the game, that's a much less risky investment, which is why some are able to pay really high prices for late stage investment, and then they're paying on the back end because so much of our funding for prescription drug spending is paid for by Medicare and Medicaid and other publicly funded sources.
And Dr. Bai, we've not really in this committee, in the entire Ways and Means Committee, explored these patient assistance programs before, and we hear them advertised almost every day. And if I understand your testimony, a dollar contribution in the name of charity by a pharmaceutical manufacturer to a patient assistance program can actually, the way they work, generate up to between $6 and $30 of profit for the pharmaceutical company.
Incremental, correct.
And if you're uninsured, the chances of getting any assistance from those programs is minimal.
Zero. It's zero.
And as Ms. Keeping explained, you can get on one of the programs, and because their standards vary and may vary, they're really up to the whim of the pharmaceutical company, you can get on and suddenly find yourself off with very serious consequences. Let me also ask you, Dr. Setzer, about your comments about offshoring, and I appreciate very much your comments in support of the offshoring legislation I've introduced. It now has over 100 sponsors here. I think as I understand your testimony, before the Republicans ever passed the Trump tax law, the pharmaceutical industry was already centered on offshoring production to countries, particularly Ireland. Now, as I understand it, after the law has passed, they're locating even more production offshore, and they can get an even bigger tax break for doing that.
That is a very accurate summary of my testimony.
And though we're told that the production would come back to the United States and the Republican tax law would bring jobs back here, I think President Trump even boasted of it last night in what I call the misstate of the Union. But you're saying that our imports of pharmaceutical products, you can measure those in trade from these countries like Ireland, are actually going up, and that likely this is, at least in part, a direct result of the incentives that were created in this tax law that are doing exactly the opposite of what we were told here they would do.
It is an undeniable fact in our measured trade statistics that pharmaceutical imports jumped immediately after the passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act.
And then one provision I think you did not get to is what's called the BEAT provision. I like the names of these provisions because they tell a lot about what they do, guilty and BEAT. So the BEAT provision is meant to reduce tax avoidance, but pharmaceutical imports are exempt from it. Is that right?
Imports of tangible goods from your own intercompany subsidiaries are exempt, which has the effect of allowing a pharmaceutical company that imports a product made in Ireland not to be caught up in the BEAT.
Thank you. And Dr. Kesselheim, again, with reference to the research and development credit itself, you raised some concerns over whether we're getting the most bang for the buck out of the research and development tax credit. It's sort of an article of faith in this committee that has enjoyed bipartisan support, but we know that it will cost about $70 billion over the next 5 years. You note that accounting firms market to pharmaceutical companies that they can claim the credit for developing technology for compliance with various regulatory agencies. In other words, they can get a tax break for following the law. Are there changes that you would like to see in the research and development tax credit as it relates to pharmaceuticals?
Yes, I would say that first of all, we should more narrowly define the scope of qualifying research activities and try to exclude activities like the ones you just described, because really what this is intended to do is to try to encourage important research and development, and that doesn't really fit that category. I think most people would agree with that. But and also part of that is part of the issue is that in often cases the IRS doesn't get enough detailed information about the activities. And so I think we also probably need to increase the amount of documentation that needs to be submitted to support a qualifying research activity to ensure that it actually is what we're trying to get at. And then I would say the final thing I would suggest is again to more specifically define what the base research activity is, because the goal here is to try to incentivize additional, at least for the credit, is to identify additional research and development. And so what we want to do is try to make sure that we're not paying for research and development that would have happened anyway.
I thank you, and I thank all of our witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Setzer, we have a full committee hearing next week on corporate tax revenues that are continuing to decline, and your comments will certainly be insightful for that as well. But all of you have offered valuable testimony. Be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing, and that those questions and answers will be made part of the committee hearing record. And with that, the committee is adjourned.
Good job. Thank you, Mike.